Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait for a minute or so while people come into the room and we'll get started. As you come into the room, you'll notice on the right side of your screen there is a poll, so it'd be really helpful for us if you're able to indicate what sort of organisation you come from, whether it's local government, NGO or private or other. So thanks so much. Rebecca, you're happy for us to just wait as people come in before we kick off, is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We've got a few more people coming in, so we will kick off very soon. While we're waiting for people to join the webinar, again, please note that there's a poll that we would like you to fill out and indicate whether you're local government, NGO, private or other. So, okay, if everyone's happy, we might get started. Okay, great. Okay, thanks everyone. And certainly welcome to this webinar on Tonkin and Taylor's Rohingya disaster impact assessment. My name is Aaron Davey, and I'm from the Council for International Development, which is a national umbrella agency for New Zealand organisations working in international development. Our role is to promote best practice and professional standards across the sector. But very importantly also, we serve as a network to create partnerships and opportunities for collaboration, to share information, training, and the like in terms of the humanitarian space. We're very happy to count Tonkin and Taylor. I'm very proud to count Tonkin and Taylor as one of our members, and along with a certain amount of other SID members, many of them are involved in the Rohingya response, including Save the Children, CBM, UNICEF, TF Fund, World Vision and Oxfam. So for those who may not be so familiar with the Rohingya crisis, in 2017, more than 700,000 Rohingya fled their homes in Myanmar to escape ethnic cleansing that they were facing. They ended up settling in east of Bangladesh, joining about 250,000 Rohingya already living there. Now, nearly 3/4 of the Rohingya community is living outside Myanmar, and this means it's one of the largest refugee camps in the world. And unfortunately, there's no sign of them returning home in the near future. In January 2020, the Myanmar government was ordered by the International Court of Justice in The Hague to do all they can to prevent genocidal violence against Rohingya and also to preserve any evidence of past crimes. So it's very much an ongoing conflict, ongoing humanitarian crisis, and one which is growing even more complex due to the multiple hazards that the community are facing, including the COVID pandemic. The United Nations Development Programme engaged with Tonkin and Taylor International to develop a multi-hazards impact model for the Rohingya refugees and surrounding host communities. And this is what, and we're really excited to hear about this from our colleagues at Tonkin and Taylor. I will go into some introductions now. So first of all, we've got Bapon Fakhrudin, who is the Technical Director in Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change. So expert on climate change risk assessment, working on disaster risk and climate resilience projects, particularly around multi-hazard assessments, but also early warning systems and emergency response and coastal community resilience. So he's worked in multiple projects over more than 25 countries throughout Asia and the Pacific. We also have Rebecca Robertson, who's a disaster risk resilience specialist. She works with a number of organisations across New Zealand, Pacific and Asia to help reduce disaster risk and build more resilient communities. Her involvement in the humanitarian sector is in developing early warning systems and carrying out climate change and natural hazard risk assessments, as well as rapid mapping in response to recent crises such as Cyclone Gita and the earthquake in Sulawesi. And last but certainly not least, we have Josie Robertson, geospatial analysis. She has a background in environmental management and GIS and climate change and ecological planning. She has worked in Fiji, Cambodia, Bangladesh, supporting climate change and natural hazard assessment. So thanks team for joining us, and by all means add anything to your introductions that I've accidentally left out. It's sort of hard to do justice to the level of expertise that you guys are bringing. So Rebecca, I'll hand over to you if you're ready to go. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Aaron. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kua hui hui mai nei ko Rebecca tōku ingoa. So thank you for that welcome and overview, Aaron, and hello to everyone online. As Aaron mentioned, my name is Rebecca and I'm a DRR specialist here at Tonkin Taylor. So firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has dialed in today. And I'd also like to thank Aaron and the rest of the team at SID for hosting this webinar with us. I'm sure I speak on behalf of many at TNT when I say we really value our partnership with you, and we're excited to see where this continues to take us. So as Aaron has mentioned, today we are talking about a significant humanitarian crisis currently occurring in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Our team was engaged in 2019 by the United Nations Development Programme and the Intersector Coordination Group for the Rohingya Humanitarian Response. The aim was to generate tropical cyclone impact scenarios to support humanitarian contingency planning and response in the Rohingya camps and surrounding community. So today we will be presenting an overview of the project methodology and our results, as well as a summary on how this project helps contingency planning and some of our high-level recommendations. So for some context, as Aaron mentioned, and I'm sure most of you know, Bangladesh is located on the northern coast of the Bay of Bengal. Our project area included the Chittagong and Cox's Bazar districts, located at the southernmost point of the country bordering Myanmar. The main refugee camps hosting the Rohingya people are located within the Ukhia and Teknaf upazilas, or administrative boundaries, as outlined in that third photo on the right by the red lines. So for some context, I'm sure most of you know, since 2017, Cox's Bazar has changed significantly with the mass influx of Rohingya refugees who are now double in number compared to the local population. This has drastically changed the landscape from rolling vegetated hills to bare cut faces in poorly consolidated sands and silts, covered now by makeshift shelters. This poses significant additional demands on local government functions, the natural resources and infrastructure. At the time of our assessment, there were no cyclone shelters or other large concrete buildings in the Rohingya camps for people to seek refuge during strong winds. Due to practices such as drying firewood on roofs, the majority of the population is constantly surrounded by a large volume of poorly secured objects, which have the potential for causing acute trauma if thrown by extreme winds. So Cox's Bazar is regularly impacted by cyclones and storms that form in the Bay of Bengal. Since 2015, the Cox's Bazar area has been affected by a number of significant events, including cyclones Mora in 2017, Ranu in 2016, and Koman in 2015. It has been estimated that the majority of the household shelters and facilities in the camps are unable to bear wind loads of over 40 kilometres per hour, During Cyclone Moore alone, approximately 70% of the shelters were found to have been damaged, and in 2018, even mildly wild wind events affected approximately 27,000 people in the refugee camps. So it is clear that work needed to be done in order to help reduce some of these risks the region is exposed to. So at a high level, the approach adopted a hazard exposure vulnerability framework for assessing risk as regularly adopted by UN agencies such as UNDP and UNDRR. This involves developing a hazard scenario to understand the area likely to be affected by each hazard, or in other words, the hazard footprint. The infrastructure within this footprint is then identified as exposed, and the vulnerability of the exposed infrastructure is then assessed to understand each of the building types' susceptibility of damage. Finally, this is all combined to give an overall impact or risk rating. I will now pass on to my colleague Bapon to provide some more detail on the hazard modelling.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the nice introduction. A cyclone hazard basically depends on could be called as a multi-hazard. It's combined with wind, heavy rainfall, and thunderstorm, and which often actually trigger coastal inundation, storm surge, landslip, and many other cascading or compound hazard within the area. The challenge in assessing the likelihood of a cyclone-driven impact is quite complex because it's driven by many factors such as cyclone intensity, the forwarding speed of the wind, as well as the, we call it structure, which is basically the radius of maximum wind, which we actually call the eyes of the cyclone. And also there is a rain impact, but it's quite harder to understand actually how much rain a cyclone of any category could bring, because it mostly depends on the convection process of the weather as well as orographic effect. So when we have been asked to do a cyclone impact modeling for most of our vulnerable people actually living in the Cox's Bazar and Teknaf area, one of the simplest way to do a impact modeling would be to understand actually what has been happening in the past and how much actually we have the data from the past to understand the impact. But that's one of the challenge a country, any of this developing world, to understand actually the 50 to 100 years long period historical cyclone track, cyclone history, cyclone impact within the area. Even though we have looked at last 50 to 100 years, or even also some of the synthetic modeling has been done in the past from 1484 to 2019, almost around 200 cyclone hit in Bangladesh. But as we are actually looking for quite specific location, it's quite hard to understand actually how many specific cyclone actually hit in that area. And looking at that number is not quite large to understand a category 4 cyclone in the Cox's Bazar. And when this kind of situation, it's quite complex to design that what could be a consequences of a category 4 cyclone in the area and how best we can actually model. And that's why we actually choose a very innovative approach, which has been recently introduced by Geoscience Australia, a tropical cyclone risk modeling. So we actually utilize a probabilistic synthetic cyclone in the area of Cox's Bazar, looking at last historical track, and try to generate the maximum probable cyclone that could bring the maximum wind speed as well as storm surge from that particular cyclone. And we generated more than 1,000 scenario in the area, and from there we actually distributed probabilistically to see the likelihood of cyclone category 1 and category 4 cyclone. And we also try to validate some of the observation data that we have in the previous cyclone event, whether actually our storm surge or our inundation actually predicting the right number. Even though it's quite challenging for a country like Bangladesh, where you don't have a high resolution DEM or such kind of topographic data to accurately measure that what would the inundation look like. So that's one of the major tasks we did for understanding the hazard itself. And then once we understand the cyclone, a Cat 4 or Cat 1, what it looked like, then we're able to model that what would be the inundation look like. And even when we are coming to the inundation scenario, that also quite complex, as you can see from the diagram. This model actually developed by World Meteorological Organization back in 2015, where we are actually quite significantly engaged with Bangladesh Meteorological Department, that how actually atmospheric, ocean, as well as coastal model could couple together to understand actually coastal inundation. And with the complex river system, the coastal area of Bangladesh is quite challenging as a whole. But even though the model is actually providing quite good operational forecasting for Bangladesh Meteorological Department. And using those that model with the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, we try to come up with a coastal inundation of Category 1 cyclone and Category 4 cyclone. But at the same time, we also generated a couple of other scenarios to understand actually the validation process. And as you can see from the model result, it's quite varied between the Cat 1 and Cat 4 cyclone inundation in the area. And even though we generated this modeling, it's as I said, it's quite varied on the fording speed, angle of approach, as well as a coastal bathymetric situation to properly integrate the scenario. But we try to put those kind of buffer within the projection so that actually we don't underestimate anything, rather than actually we try to have some safe side in the modeling approach. The other model that we consider on the landslide modeling at the same time, and the detailed DEM only available in the camp area, which is mainly in the Kotupalang camp area. And that's why our landslide modeling was only that particular area. It doesn't cover the entire Cox's Bazar or in the residential area other than the camp area. And one of the simplistic approach that we applied, that anything that cliff angle which is above 45 degree could create a risk for the landslide in the area, and everything which is below 35 degree angle could be a safer side in the area. So that's how we try to generate the landslide hazard. Also, we looked at the extreme precipitation or extreme rainfall in the area, that what it could generate the rainfall situation, and as well as some other existing flood modeling that has been done in the area by Deltaris and other organizations, that how actually that perform together with the cyclone hazard modeling, coastal inundation modeling, as well as landslip modeling. So that's how actually we try to come up with the overall coastal inundation as well as flood scenario. The other modeling, we did a wind modeling to look at actually how a Cat 1 and Cat 4 cyclone could create maximum scenario within the area. And as you can see from here, my colleague Josie will be sharing with you more detail the visualization, actually what are the exposure as well as risk on wind risk. But we try to understand actually what kind of threshold could create a maximum risk for camp area. And as that has been defined, like a 50 kilometer per hour wind speed could generate a quite significant effect in the camp area. And as you can see from Cat 1 and Cat 4, either of any cyclone could actually create huge devastation in the area. I think now I'd like to hand over my speech to Josie to talk about exposure and vulnerability, as well as data integration in the modeling. You are mute, Josie.
Thanks for that, Bapon, and for a webinar without someone on mute. I will now broadly cover our data collection process. This project produced a unique challenge for data collection and quality control. There was often high quality GIS data for some of the camps, but not for the host communities. For camp areas, there's been a fair amount of work within the humanitarian space, and this meant there was actually a large quantity of up-to-date data on key assets such as schools, medical centres, and building footprints. The challenge was determining what NGOs had the most accurate, up-to-date data, and then to find comparative data for the host community. In the camp areas, footprints were sourced from UNISAT drone surveys, and UN asset points that represented schools and hospitals were joined to the appropriate footprints to give us accurate data with great building use information. In the host community, though, this was more of a challenge. We extracted the building footprints for the area from OpenStreetMap. Coverage was really inconsistent, and the attribution was inaccurate and lacking, meaning we couldn't identify assets such as hospitals. Once approximately 3,000 missing footprints were manually digitised from aerials, the location of all schools and medical facilities were extracted from Google Maps and then spatially joined to the OpenStreetMap footprints to give us a more complete data set. Once we had finalised our infrastructure data, we were able to undertake our exposure assessments. An exposure assessment was conducted to understand the population, buildings, and significant infrastructure such as hospitals or schools exposed to each tropical cyclone-related hazard. For our exposure assessment, we overlaid our hazard data and intersected that with our infrastructure layers in order to derive which assets would be impacted by each scenario. Using an average number of people per household, we could then estimate the number of people exposed. I have an example on the right here of one of our exposure assessments. This image shows a particular area of one of the refugee camps and the wind speed that each individual building was exposed to in our synthetic category 4 scenario. The wind speeds in this area you can see range from around 240 to 260 kilometres an hour and impact the entire area. Once we had run our exposure assessments, we were then able to determine the risk to buildings and people in our vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability is generally represented by a vulnerability curve or fragility function. Typically, fragility functions are developed based on historical damage and loss data for similar hazard intensity events. Fragility functions provide an estimate of the damage ratio to a specific element at risk, coupled with hazard intensity information such as increasing wind speed. For our study, we applied fragility functions in the cyclone wind and coastal inundation hazard scenarios. For the landslide scenario, however, we used a combination of risk categories based on exposure level and building material. Therefore, to accurately determine our risk, we needed to divide our footprints by building material to establish how they would respond in each of the hazard scenarios. From our research, we derived that the structures in our area could be split into the following 3 categories: reinforced concrete, concrete, or shelter. Since this information was not available with our source data, we were able to categorise these through a series of classification parameters. For example, buildings within the camp that were over 15 metres squared but under 150 metres squared were likely not supplementary structures or significant buildings such as aid centres, and so we were able to categorise these as shelter structures. Within the host community, we used a combination of square metre categories, OpenStreetMap attributes, and aerial interrogation in order to combat any bias that may arise. For instance, a high-rise apartment building would have a small square footage on an aerial, but it would be made of reinforced concrete, so we needed to ensure these structures were classified as so. Once our building footprints had been classified, we could proceed with our vulnerability analysis and produce some results. To present the results to the client, we created a really basic GIS viewer. It allowed the client to see all the hazard, exposure, and risk scenarios, and they could inspect the entire area at several scales, even individual buildings if they liked. I will now give a general summary of our overall results. Coastal inundation was in general to impact the host communities the most. Many of the camps are actually located quite far inland, and so there was minor risk to camp locations. However, several host community cities and towns are on the coast. This area on the right shows Cox's Bazar, and in particular the airport and commercial area along the Bakali River. Several of these critical buildings are at high or extreme risk to coastal inundation. Moving on to wind. As previously touched on by Bapon, cyclone winds were catastrophic in the area. They placed more people, structures, and assets at risk than any other hazard. The camp shelters are often made of bamboo and so are critically impacted by winds over 40 kilometres an hour. This meant that in all 3 of our wind scenarios, all the shelters and consequently people within the camps were at extreme risk. In the synthetic category 4 scenario, several host buildings were also at moderate risk of damage. The image on the right shows the border of one of the camps. As you can see in red, all the shelters are in the extreme risk category, whereas the larger aid and school structures are moderately impacted, in addition to some of the host communities in the north of the image. Finally, our landslide assessment. Shelters and concrete asset buildings are at risk to landslide throughout the Ukhia camps. These are sparsely distributed rather than clustered, which reflected the short slopes of the hilly terrain. The landslip assessment also only identified buildings that may be damaged due to land subsidence beneath the building, but does not identify those that may be impacted further down the slope by material inundating the buildings or shelters. Without detailed landslip modelling, including ground investigations, understanding how the landslide material may move down slopes is extremely difficult. Now we have wrapped up the results, I'll pass you over to Rebecca to summarise our findings.
Great, thanks Bapon and Josie. So a number of key recommendations were identified during the course of this project to help increase the accuracy of this assessment, which will in turn better inform contingency planning in the future. So as Josie alluded to, one of the significant limitations of this study was the availability, accuracy, and resolution of data, particularly in the host community. In order to improve disaster impact assessments in the future, effort should be placed on obtaining higher quality data across the region. Some examples of this include undertaking detailed LiDAR surveys of the host area to better model all hazards to understand potential risk and impact. Increasing the rainfall station network throughout Cox's Bazar will provide greater detail to understanding extreme rainfall events that may have significant impact on both the camp and the host community. Undertaking a comprehensive stocktake of building numbers and their materials to better understand the vulnerability of both the camps and the host community will also improve accuracy of disaster impact assessments. As also mentioned, we suggest that a detailed landslip assessment be undertaken in the camps. This should include detailed ground investigations to better understand the characteristics of inundation areas or other known as areas where material may fall onto shelters or roads. Finally, we encourage the continued development and implementation of community resilience planning and training activities. This should include an adequate community training program on early warning and evacuation, so as those living in the camps are able to take early action, such as tying down loose items and moving to safe evacuation locations to minimize the loss of life. So in summary, experience of conducting preparedness and response has shown that secondary data can be effectively utilized to build an accurate picture of risk before a disaster occurs. Effective disaster impact models can be created before a disaster by utilizing hazard data, such as cyclone tracks and wave patterns, alongside logistics, population, and housing data. These models assist the humanitarian community to calculate estimates of the number of people affected by a specific disaster, as well as identifying how many people would most likely require humanitarian assistance. This informs response planning and operational readiness, which is central to optimizing the speed, volume, and quality of humanitarian assistance to be delivered during a large-scale disaster, especially for such a highly vulnerable community. The key outputs of this project were provided to the government and key humanitarian stakeholders to provide them with the knowledge they need to manage residual risk through risk-informed planning, to help minimize impacts of future cyclone or storm events with the hopes of preserving life and protecting some of our most vulnerable. So that concludes our formal presentation, and I would now like to hand back to Aaron to facilitate any questions. Ngā mihi nui kia koe, haere rā.
Kia ora. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Rebecca, Josie, and Bapon, and great to see you back up on screen. So yeah, would love to facilitate any questions that you have. So please do put those in the chat room. I have a couple questions I'd like to kick off with. I found it really fascinating hearing about the categorisation of buildings and the like, and I was wondering from an aid distribution perspective whether there's any comments you can make on some of the data findings around location recommendations. Were you able to sort of see where aid distribution centres were located, the sort of buildings that they were generally housed in? And I'm starting to think about things around access issues for disability and the like as well. So just wondered if there was any comments you could make on location of aid distribution and the centres and the like in your findings, or whether that was outside the scope of the project.
Yeah, for within the camp areas, thanks to the wide amount of data that was previously available from other NGOs, we actually did get to see a really great scope about where all the aid facilities were located, medical centres, and a kind of improvised schooling. So the distribution of those throughout the camps was actually really great. The buildings that they were in, a lot of these facilities were developed quite early on in the camps kind of progress, and so these buildings over time have become a little bit bigger, and some are made of like slightly better materials and concrete and such, so they did fare a little bit better, some of them, but it's one of those, like, there are a fair amount that were critically impacted in our results. As far as the host community, I think this did show, particularly with coastal inundation, the main centre, which is Cox's Bazar, which supplies a lot of the materials and things to the camps, that was quite critically impacted, especially the airport. So that was an interesting finding that we could look at, that could be something that perhaps hasn't been considered before as an impact of cyclone hazards.
Thanks, Josie.
And just adding to that one, I mean, also this modeling actually well tested in last cyclone that hit in May 2020, which is like a cyclone Amphan. And the model result actually quite well predicted the category of the cyclone, and it gives the scenario that what it could happen within the camp area as well as in the residential host area. And I think that was a huge amount of helpful information for even HCR as well as the local government there to prepare their response plan, and they actually well prepared and make sure that there was a zero casualty in the area.
I will just add as well that your comment around identifying locations that might be better suited, that wasn't necessarily within our scope, but is definitely a natural progression that we could move on to with the hazard footprint results, where we could maybe identify areas that are of lower risk, where you would want to kind of stock take your response items and things like that. So yeah, not really within the scope of this project, but it would definitely be a natural progression following on from our findings.
Thanks, Rebecca, Josie and Bapon. Another question, really interested to know how you do handle multiple hazards at the same time, but particularly how do you handle hazards when they may not already be part of or have even been identified within a current plan?
Yep, that's a quite important question, Aaron, you just raised actually. As you see that with this COVID situation, many countries having the same problem to respond when you have ongoing pandemic situation is going on, and how you can actually manage your additional evacuation plan or response plan for a cyclone category 1 or category 4. And having this kind of detailed modeling actually quite helped them to better prepare in advance that how actually a cascading and compounding risk could occur, and what kind of contingency plan they could actually take care of that things. As I said in my talk, actually cyclone itself is a multi-hazard. So if you want to prepare a cyclone response plan, you actually need to look at quite a number of hazards that could occur as a primary as well as secondary. And that plan gives quite well to response for the community. And same example we actually proven in the Fiji recently with the similar cyclone category.
Thanks so much, Bapon. Any other questions? Please just do put them in the chat. I've got another question here, and I think I'm interested about the management of the project, in particular, whether COVID pandemic and everything so unpredicted about this year. And I'm sort of thinking of some of the access issues and restrictions that suddenly came into place sort of in the particularly in March and April, you know, how the project was managed around some of those unexpected disruptions, or whether the project in fact was not so impacted by them. But yeah.
No, I mean, we were supposed to be visiting over there, and I think that the visit would have really helped to kind of ground truth some of our findings and just provide us with a little bit more detail. But I think it must have been the week we were supposed to be going over. I think we got put into level 4 lockdown. So yeah, we would not be going anywhere. And also having to present these findings back to those based in Bangladesh. So we had to quickly set up a webinar similar to this where we could present our findings for them. So I think like everyone at the moment, it really impacted us, and it came quite at the wrong time at the end of our project, and being able to go over there and kind of, you know, ground truth what we'd seen and just give a bit more perspective, I think would have been really helpful. But in a previous project that we actually did for the camps as well a couple of years ago, we had some input from Oxfam, who provided us with some photos on the ground, which I think helped to give us some of that local perspective, because I think when you're doing these things remotely, it is really hard to get that local context. So we've really valued Oxfam in the previous project to provide us with that context.
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, unless there's any further questions, we'll wrap up. Was there anything further any of you wanted to add before we conclude? No? Okay.
I mean, just to adding in the last comment that obviously this kind of modeling is quite new and innovative at this current state, but it's also quite complex to develop. But having some example as well as testing in the ground, it gives us actually quite strong confidence that we actually able to help the people who actually need help in this space, because some of this hazard is quite complex and compound, and we should actually try to emphasize how actually advanced science and technology those are actually available could bring into the operational domain and help our people actually who need most help in the community. So that would be my last one.
Thanks, Bapan. Yes, no, it's the work of Tonkin and Taylor and the fact that it's been done in partnership with UNDP and also in partnership with many organisations such as Oxfam, you know, it makes me really excited about the opportunities that partnering with organisations like Tonkin and Taylor affords the humanitarian sector. And also this talk has been a really stark reminder to me about how vulnerable groups are often driven into even more vulnerable situations due to a lack of opportunity. And so it's really heartening to hear that this work has been done. So look, thank you, everyone, and particularly thank you to our panelists, Rebecca, Josie, and Bapon, and we sort of look forward to hearing about the next stages of this work anyway, and by all means, everyone that has joined the presentation, feel free to stay in contact with us, and we'll look to provide any further information that you may want to follow up. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.